Autumn leaves underscore the transition of the season, whether strewn about like shifting blankets or pulled up in tufts, they mirror our psychic inbox filled with end-of-year summaries, initiatives, holiday invites and lists, and a slew of political signs and ornaments gracing lawns and doors. And that's just the tip of the autumn iceberg. So in the stage of information overload in our collective cluttered minds comes our author, Tim Harford, to rescue our lives by not giving us another book about decluttering our lives, because, that book was already written and we also have it on sale as a bestseller. But this book talks about embracing the chaos of clutter, embracing the chaos of overflow and the unknown, and how that leads to innovation. Tim Harford, as you know, is an economist, journalist, and multimedia broadcaster. He's a senior columnist at the Financial Times and the presenter of his weekly syndicated program, More or Less, airing on BBC Radio. Mr. Harford is the author of the multi-million-selling The Undercover Economist, and also the author of the recent book, Adapt: Why Success Always Starts with Failure. Continuing on the theme of innovation, his new book, Messy, pretty much goes towards embracing change through innovation, innovating change through change. So please welcome our author, Tim Harford.
Well, thank you very much. It's a particular pleasure to be back in Politics and Prose. The very first book talk I ever gave was in Politics and Prose with my baby, thank you, my baby daughter being pushed backwards and forwards at the back of the store. She's now 12 years old. She's at high school, and a lot of things have changed, but Politics and Prose is still here, still going strong, and still hosting talks from not only your favorite authors, but also me. So I'm really genuinely delighted to be back. So this is a book about mess. I'm very happy to talk about the new president-elect in the Q&A, and in fact, he does feature in one of the chapters where I talk about the use of mess aggressively, the use of mess as a competitive weapon, and it can work very well, as we have seen. But I don't want to start on that note. I want to start by talking about the ways in which mess can sometimes help us and sometimes enrich our lives. And I wanted particularly to take you back to a concert that was played in January 1975 in the German town of Cologne. And I want you to picture the great Cologne Opera House in your minds. It's a huge, huge concert hall, capacity of 1,400 people. And I want you to imagine a young German girl walking out onto the stage, just 17 years old. Her name's Vera Brandes, and gazing out at the auditorium, which at that moment is empty. It's just lit by the green glow of the emergency exit sign. And to feel her excitement, because this is going to be an amazing day for Vera. She's just a young girl, but she loves jazz. She wants more jazz to come to Cologne, and so she's just made it happen. She's just started to invite jazz musicians and promote gigs, and almost the very first gig that she manages to get off the ground is the American jazz pianist Keith Jarrett is coming to the Cologne Opera House to play a late-night concert of jazz, and it's a sellout. 1,400 people are going to show up. And Jarrett is going to do one of his remarkable piano improvisations. He will just walk out onto the stage in front of that packed house. He'll sit down at the piano. No rehearsal, no sheet music. He's just going to play. But Vera is introducing Keith to the piano at this moment. It's not going so well. So Keith takes a look at the piano, walks around it. There's a suspicious look on his face. He plays a couple of notes. He goes over to his producer, Manfred Eicher, and Eicher comes over to the piano and walks around it and looks suspiciously and plays a couple of notes. And then Jarrett and Eicher mutter together. And by this time, of course, Vera is feeling seriously nervous. And then Eicher comes over to Vera Brandes and says, if you don't get a new piano, Keith won't play. Now, Keith is not being a prima donna here. There is a lot wrong with this piano. There's been some kind of mix-up. The clue's in the name, Cologne Opera House. They're into opera. They're not into jazz. And the removal guys from the opera house have somehow got confused, and they've brought up this rehearsal model. It's beaten up. The black keys are sticking. White keys are out of tune. The pedals don't work. The upper registers of the piano are harsh and tinny because the felt's all worn away. And most seriously, it's not a grand piano. Vera Brandes later said, yeah, it was like a tiny piano. It was like half a piano. It's not loud enough. It's not going to reach the back of the auditorium. It won't reach the people sitting in the far rows. It's unplayable. And so Keith, understandably, says he's not going to play. So Vera then gets on the phone and she's trying to get a replacement piano. But look, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday in Germany. They've gone home. There's no way. There's no way. She manages to get hold of a piano tuner who can at least get some of the keys in tune, although some of them are beyond saving. And all the other faults with the piano, they can't be fixed. So Vera really then has only one option. She goes out to where Keith Jarrett is sitting in his car. And she stands there in the rain. And she begs him. And Jarrett looks out of his car window at this bedraggled German teenage girl. And he takes pity on her. He says, never forget. Only for you. And so a few hours later, Keith Jarrett walks out in front of that packed auditorium. He sits down at the unplayable piano, and he begins. So within a few minutes, within a few seconds, it becomes apparent that something magical is happening. Jarrett is avoiding these tinny upper registers. He's playing in the middle of the keyboard, and that makes everything very soothing and ambient. But by itself, that wouldn't, make for an exciting piece of music, although it's very pleasant. But of course, he also has to cope with the fact that the piano is too quiet. And so he sets up these rolling arpeggios, these rumbling riffs in the bass, just trying to build up enough resonance that the piano can be heard. And the most important thing, he's standing up, he's twisting, he's pounding down on the keys, desperately just trying to create enough volume to reach the back of the auditorium. And so this piece has got this tension. There's the soothing restfulness of the middle of the keyboard, and yet at the same time, there's the dynamism of the energy that Keith is putting into it just to get the volume up. And it's an electrifying combination, a magical piece of music. Not the piece of music that Keith Jarrett ever imagined that he would play, but it's brilliant nonetheless. And the reason that we can listen to it is because just before Keith went on stage, he got together with his producer and they said, you know what, we should record this. Because we want documentary evidence of what a musical catastrophe sounds like. so that we can play it to all future concert promoters to tell them to make sure they get the right piano. But they didn't get documentary evidence of a musical catastrophe. They got the Cologne concert. And the Cologne concert is the best-selling solo jazz album in history. The best-selling piano album in history. I've got 3 children. 2 of them were born while my wife was listening to this music. It's a masterpiece. But think about Keith Jarrett's original reaction. When they told him about the unplayable piano, when he met the unplayable piano, he didn't think to himself, excellent, creative stimulus, this is going to be good. He thought, a bad piano is a bad piano, this is not going to help me. And remember, Keith Jarrett is one of the most adventurous musicians around. I think his reaction is the same reaction that any of us would have in, well, I mean, I've never been put in a remotely comparable situation, but when you're asked to go and do good work, and then all these obstacles are put in your way, incompetent colleagues, tools that break in your hand, distractions, you're short of time, you haven't been able to prepare, whatever. We think that these obstacles, we think that these problems, we think that the mess that we've been presented with is going to make things worse. And of course, sometimes it does. But sometimes it doesn't. Surprisingly often, we overcome those difficulties and they actually help us solve problems in ways we would not have imagined. But the first thing that we have to do is to overcome that very natural resistance that Keith Jarrett was feeling. In the end, after being handed that mess, he embraced it and he soared. But why is it that I think that these obstacles, frustrations, distractions, why is it that I think they might actually help us? Well, there are a few different perspectives I want to share with you briefly. There's one from cognitive psychology, one from computer science, one from social psychology, and one from rock and roll, just to round things off. And when you see the problem from all of these different angles, then maybe you'll agree. So let's talk about cognitive psychology first. So we've known for a while that when you put modest obstacles in people's way, they will often overcompensate for those obstacles. So just to give you one very simple example that I find appealing, there are lots and lots in the literature. A group of psychologists led by Daniel Oppenheimer a few years ago, about 6 years ago, teamed up with high school teachers. And they said, okay, what we want your class handouts. So these teachers all taught multiple classes. So we're going to randomize some of your classes. For every handout they get, it's going to be formatted in Times New Roman or Helvetica, something easy to read. For your other classes, all of their handouts will be formatted in maybe the cursive of monotype Corsiva, or the Germanic punch of Hattenschweiler. Hattenschweiler's difficult to describe. It's very German, Hattenschweiler. Or the zesty bounce of Comic Sans italicized, one of these fonts. And all of the handouts are going to be written in these difficult fonts. Now you'd think that's not going to help. Right? If you get a handout written in Times New Roman, it is easier to read than if you get a handout written in Hattenschweiler. Trust me, Hattenschweiler is not an easy font to read. But yet, at the end of the semester, these kids got their exams, and the ones who had been given the difficult fonts throughout the semester did better on their exams. So why? Well, probably because when you're given a handout in Hattenschweiler, you go, what is this? And you look really carefully. It's not easy to read, and so you have to slow down. It might not be totally straightforward to pick out every word, and so you have to do more work reading around it and this is all happening very quickly. I mean, this is not, I should stress, they didn't format it in Wingdings, right? I mean, it wasn't all written in emojis. It wasn't an impossible obstacle. It was just a speed bump. Slowed them down. They had to think more. They had to work harder. They had to pay closer attention, and they did better. And I think you can bet Keith Jarrett was really paying attention. Okay, he plays a lot of good pianos. He does not often have the privilege of playing in Comic Sans. But that night he did, and he was paying attention. So that's a perspective from cognitive psychology, but I promised you various perspectives, because I don't find any single one of these views of the problem completely convincing by itself. You've got to sort of see it from different angles. So here's another angle. Computer science. Okay? Let's talk about the computer science of solving big, complex maths problems. So you give big, complex maths problems to computers, and you could say, okay, find the solution to this problem. When you get to a certain kind of problem, there are lots of them out there, the computers can't find a solution because there's not enough time. The problem's too big. You have to work systematically through, try out all these different possible solutions, check all these different possible answers, and it just takes too long. And so what you need to do instead is program the computer to search for a reasonable solution, a pretty good solution, in a reasonable amount of time. So the kind of problems I'm talking about are logistical problems, plotting sort of routes for delivery trucks, which get surprisingly complicated surprisingly quickly. Or, here's another example, very practical example, arranging the components on a silicon chip. Now, silicon chips have tens of thousands, it's probably hundreds of thousands of components these days, or millions. I lose track. I'm just a humble economist. I'm not a silicon chip designer. They've got a lot of components. And those components can be wired and will work fine. All kinds of different arrangements, all sorts of different wiring. They will work fine. But some of those arrangements are very inefficient in their use of space, and some are much more efficient. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of people who would like to figure out more efficient ways to pack components on silicon chips. The way that this problem has been solved is to program an algorithm to experiment and to push around and to try different ways of arranging the components. Well, but how would you do that? Because the number of different ways you could arrange it is just impossibly large. There's no way you could check everything. So here's a possible solution. Let's go step by step. We'll just look for improvements. So start randomly, and then from that starting point, just find a couple of components, swap them. Is that better or worse? If it's better, do that. If it's worse, don't do it. Very simple. Then do it again, do it again, do it again. Just keep trying these pairwise swaps. And because you're making progress, every time you find an improvement, you're just making gradual progress. It's potentially a very powerful way of finding a solution. It turns out it's only half the solution. It's a very promising way to solve this kind of problem, but in the end it fails. And the reason it fails is because this process of step-by-step improvement gets stuck. So an analogy is you're trying to climb Mount Everest, and your method is just wherever you are, find somewhere that's uphill and step there. And just keep going. And that will get you to the top of Mount Everest if you started at the bottom of Mount Everest. Actually, I'm not even sure it will. If you started at the bottom of Mount Fuji, it'll get you to the top of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is very smooth. However, if you are, say, standing at the bottom of a pitcher's mound, it will get you to the top of the pitcher's mound. And then you're like, well, how do I get to Mount Everest from here? And the answer is you can't, because every direction is down. And your algorithm says you have to keep going up. So that's just to give you a sense of how these algorithms fail. They get stuck. And they often get stuck very, very quickly down some little dead end. And they can't go backwards because they're always looking for improvements. There are lots of ways to address this problem, but you know what they all boil down to? All the different ways that computer scientists have found to address this problem, they all boil down to adding noise. You just give your algorithm a shove sideways. Lots of ways to do it. And then you see if it finds a better, and then you give it another one, and another one. And that combination of the step-by-step improvement, that hill climbing, plus random shocks, that'll get you a good solution. It's very, very effective. So, of course, I'm not saying in this book that we need to abandon skill. Keith Jarrett's a very good piano player, right? He's really, really good. That was important. But he found a better way to play when the unplayable piano just went, all right, Keith, start somewhere new. Here are these 12 keys, none of them are working. And I'd steer clear of that if I were you, and you don't want to play that one. and now see what you find. And of course, then he applies his brilliant gift as a pianist, and he goes somewhere magical. But that sounds slightly, well, it's still it's silicon chips and it's jazz geniuses. What does this mean for me? I'll give you a perfectly everyday example. I just wanted to check how many people got here on the metro. Anyone? I did. Not many. It's raining, I guess. A few people. So in London, we've got our own metro. We call it the Tube, London Underground, and I'm sure the DC Metro is never disrupted, but London Underground is sometimes disrupted. And a couple of years ago, there was a strike that shut down the London Underground for 48 hours. Okay, not that long, but if you need to get to work. The particular form this strike took was that 2/3 of the London Underground stations closed, but some stayed open. There were different unions involved. So some of the stations are still open. Some of the lines are working. Some of the lines are not working. And there's also the buses. They're fine. Overground trains. They connect to the underground. They're fine. So how do people get to work? Well, it turns out we can track everybody because they're all using these smart card things. And a couple of researchers, three researchers, after the fact, found people who they could track just making the same journey every single day. And there's a technical term for these people. They're called commuters. And you would think if anybody has just really got their route down pat, it's the commuters. Like, commuters have optimized their route. Surely commuters, if anybody has optimized anything, commuters have optimized their route to work, right? Turns out not. Because the researchers found the subset of commuters, most of them, who had to change their route because of the strike, had to find a different way to get to work. And then they said, okay, what happens when the strike ends? And the answer is, of course, most people go back to the original route. But tens of thousands of people didn't. There was a substantial minority of commuters who their whole lives have been travelling the wrong way to work. All it took was one puny little 2-day strike and they found a better way. That's all it took. And that's exactly the same process that I'm describing with the silicon chips and with Keith Jarrett being knocked sideways. That sometimes the disruption, it starts your quest for a solution somewhere new. And sometimes you find something a lot better than what you were starting with. So that's the perspective from computer science. What about the perspective from social psychology? Well, I mean, there's nothing more disruptive than other people, right? Social psychology is the study of other people and how we interact with people. And there's a lot of really good work about the effect of diversity in teams and how teams help people solve problems and the conditions under which diverse teams are better at problem solving. And the conditions are anywhere, really, where you've got to solve an interesting problem. I mean, if you need to absolutely be coordinated and what you're doing is very predictable and you need to understand each other very well, and sometimes a really homogeneous team of people who all think in exactly the same way, sometimes that's helpful. But usually the diverse team is better at solving problems. And by diverse, I mean different perspectives, different ways of thinking. And that could be gender, could be age, could be nationality, could be professional training, could be all kinds of different reasons why people are thinking differently. But if you've got 4 people in the room who see a problem in the same way, and you add a 5th person with a totally different viewpoint, coming from a totally different angle, that 5th person may well help the other 4 find something that they hadn't seen, even if the 4 people are really, really good at what they do. And even if the 5th person is actually not that good, the difference is what helps. So there's lots of research on this, but a piece of research that really caught my eye was conducted by 3 psychologists led by Catherine Phillips of Northwestern University. And what she did was to divide students into groups of 4 and ask them to solve these murder mystery problems. So you're given a dossier of evidence, there's been a murder and, here's the crime scene photos and the witness statements and alibis and all this data that you've got, and here are 3 people who might have done it and who actually killed him. Here are the 3 people. So you're working through this. It's a hypothetical crime. it turns out it's quite difficult to solve. So if you give somebody one of these dossiers in 20 minutes, the chance they get the right guy is a little bit less than 50%. Okay, and bear in mind, it's multiple choice, right? So like chimps get 33%. So humans very slightly better than chimps, they get to nearly 50%. So now you give it to a group of 4 friends. This is what Catherine Phillips did. Group of 4 friends. They're all students. 20 minutes. Did they get any better? Yeah, a bit. They just nudged over 50%. So they did a little bit better because they could rely on each other. But basically they still struggled with this problem. Then Catherine Phillips carried out the other half of this experiment. What she did was to say, okay, instead of 3 friends, it's going to be 3 friends. Instead of 4 friends, it's going to be 3 friends and 1 stranger, for maximum awkwardness. Okay, the 3 of you are trying to have a conversation. There's this guy standing there in a corner that you don't know. Now, interestingly, there's not a massive amount of diversity here. I mean, these are still all students. What Catherine Phillips has really added to the mix is just awkwardness, pure awkwardness. The success rate of the 3 friends and the stranger was 75%. But here's what really matters about that. Catherine Phillips asked these groups of people, how did it go? And when she talked to the 4 friends, they said, we had a great time, things were cool. Do you think you solved the problem? Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we got him. So the success rate's 50%. They're very confident. Ask the groups of 3 friends and the stranger, did you have a good time? Well, no, not really. It was kind of awkward, the whole thing. No, didn't enjoy it. But do you think you solved the problem? I'm not sure about that. So the groups of the 4 friends were complacent, not terribly successful, had a very high rating of their own competence. The groups of the 3 friends and the stranger, systematically much better and systematically feeling much worse. They weren't at all confident and they hadn't enjoyed themselves. And this is the thing about these disruptions, whether the disruption is the unplayable piano or the disruption is the awkward stranger. Sometimes we don't realize it's helping us, even at the moment that it is helping. It's not just that we don't think it will help us. It's after it's helped us, we're still in denial. That was no fun. So we reject the fact that this has made things better. Which is why the perspective from rock and roll, and I want to leave you with, I think is so important. So I discussed all of this with one of my favorite musicians. His name is Brian Eno. So Brian Eno started off in a band called Roxy Music. He stood behind Brian Ferry playing keyboards with a giant plastic knife and fork. Then he left Roxy Music and he created an album called Another Green World. Prince, rest his soul, Prince said Another Green World was the greatest album he ever heard. He then created something called ambient music, which is this beautiful, dreamy, totally new sonic aesthetic. And the other thing Brian Eno did was to work as a producer, or either producer or collaborator, with a whole bunch of interesting people. So the choreographer Twyla Tharp, the minimalist composer Philip Glass, Devo, Coldplay, U2, David Bowie. David Bowie's 3 great Berlin albums. Brian Eno was there in the room. And what was he doing? What does he do for all of these people? He messes with their minds. That is his job. His role is to be the awkward stranger, or to make them play the unplayable piano, or to be the ugly font. That's what he does. And the results are these fantastic albums. So just to give you an example, he made Adrian Belew, this great kind of fantastic guitarist, made Adrian Belew once play a guitar solo to a piece of music, accompany a piece of music he'd never heard. And he wouldn't tell him what key it was in, just had to listen to it and play. But also, while this was happening, Adrian Belew was like, Carlos Alomar's on the drums. So Carlos Alomar is also one of the world's greatest guitarists, and Carlos is sitting on the drums. He doesn't play the drums, sitting on the drums, looking pretty annoyed. Like, why is Carlos on the drums? Don't worry, Adrian. Carlos is going to... He looks cross. Why is he on the drums? Don't worry about it. Just play 1, 2. Carlos is going to give you the 1, 2, 3. So, what key is it? Don't worry about the key. Just play. And Adrian said, it was like a freight train coming through my mind. The solo's on Boys Keep Swinging. If you Google Boys Keep Swinging, David Bowie's wearing a very nice dress. The guitar solo is unbelievable. And it was played by somebody who was just in total cognitive panic. He had no idea what was happening. And this is what Eno would do. He would, and the main tool he had this deck of cards called the oblique strategies. He would sort of take out a card at random. And these cards would say things like, everyone swap instruments, or play in a very dark room, very loudly, or find the most embarrassing detail and amplify it. The thing is, the musicians hated it. They hated it. Carlos Alomar said, this stuff sounds like crap, David. Phil Collins played the drums on Another Green World. He was so furious with the whole thing. He was throwing beer cans across the studio. He would just, there was so much stress. But I said to Brian, so what's going on? And he said, well, look, if you have an accident, you really start paying attention to everything. You know, you feel that sense of danger. Your brain is noticing everything. You are totally alert. Alertness is the friend of creativity. When people are alert, when they're paying attention, that's when they do their great work. So my role is to kind of make them feel sort of like they're in the middle of an accident. And then they start paying attention. Or if you want a more positive metaphor, it's like when you go to a new place, when you're a tourist, you go to a new city, and especially if it's a really foreign place, really strange place, you notice every detail. It's fascinating. And the memories are so rich. And the thoughts that it sparks. But it's partly a result of the stress. It's just everything is new. Everything is new, and your brain is saying, you better pay attention to this. And that's what Brian Eno would do to these people, and with amazing results. But the thing is about the oblique strategies, they were originally just a list, just a checklist of ideas. Try this, try this, try this. And he realized the list didn't work. And the reason the list didn't work is that you would look down the list, your eye would just settle on whatever was the least disruptive, whatever was not going to spoil your plans, and you do that, which of course misses the point entirely. So he said, I realized it needed to be random, needed to be a deck of cards, and you just draw one, and then you have to confront it. And that's how it works. Because he understood, we are going to try and wriggle out of this. We are going to try and be in a team of people with our friends, with people who look like us, with people who think like us. We're not going to seek out the awkward stranger. We're not going to reformat our stuff in an ugly font. We will resist for very understandable reasons. But actually, these obstacles, these stresses, they can help us. They can make us more creative. They can make us more resilient. They can help us find new solutions. And so that's why Eno knew. It's got to be a card. It's got to be at random. Because you're going to need help. Whatever it is, whether it's the sheer randomness of the card, whether it's force of will, or whether it's collaborating with an incredibly stressful person like Brian Eno, or whether it's a guilt trip from a German teenager. Whatever it is that gets us into that state, all of us from time to time have to learn to sit down and try and play the unplayable piano. I'm very happy to take questions, but thank you for listening. So, it's a question from the lady there. Can you reach the mic? Can you get to the microphone easily, or I can? If you can't, I'll repeat your question for everyone. But yeah, there's a microphone there. If you can reach it, that's because then everyone can hear, and also the people here listening on the interwebs will also hear us.
Am I to conclude from this that our country, after 4 years with Donald Trump, is going to be so much better than it has ever been in our whole lives?
We've gone. Thank you for your question. We've gone there already. Fine. So I wrote a piece about a month ago Because I come to you from the land of Brexit. And in the land of Brexit, I don't know whether this is probably an experience that you will seem strange to you, but can you imagine going through a campaign where there's lots of viciousness, there's violence, lies, and every sane person in the country says that this is one way to go, and yet somehow the country doesn't seem very interested in sanity. And then you're checking the results throughout the night, and it becomes clear that against all expectations, against all predictions, your country appears to have voted for utter insanity. I know it's hard for you to understand how we felt. And then to have to start to have the conversations, because you realise, well, actually, half the country did have a different view, and so what do we do? How do we get out of this mess? All of this. So a month ago, I wrote a piece about the UK and about leaving the European Union, saying, okay, what if this decision is the unplayable piano? Where are the advantages? What might unexpectedly work out well? I have to admit, I didn't really believe what I wrote. But then if you had asked Keith Jarrett before he started to play, do you think that this is going to work out well? He would, of course, said no. So I think it's important to recognise that whenever these setbacks and obstacles hit us, I don't say, oh, just be cheerful, just be optimistic, everything will be fine. I think that's the wrong answer. But you have to immediately say, okay, things are changing around here. Things are going to have to change. We're going to have to change. How do we make as many of those changes as possible positive changes? Suddenly a lot of these keys that we relied on being able to play, we can't play them anymore. Well, how might avoiding those keys and trying to do something in a different way, how might that help? So that I think that is the only comfort I can offer. Obviously, sometimes, a disaster is just a disaster. Sometimes a mess is just a mess. And I don't want to say, and in everything, just wonderful things are definitely always going to come out of it. But we always need to look for the opportunities. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, so that's the segue to my question, which is, obviously not every mess leads to a productive result. So what's the secret sauce here? I mean, when is a mess just a mess? When is frustration just frustrating? And when is the kind of ratio of, opportunity to inhibition, optimal? How do you optimize this? Is there some principle that transcends all these examples, or do you have to find it every time, kind of?
So I think thank you. I think in the search for optimization, that's not a very messy way to look for things. That's a very tidy sort of approach. So we're going to find the optimum amount of mess. I don't think there's not going to be an optimum, because it will be different for every situation. I think there are a few things that we can say. So one thing is, when we have a very highly structured situation, electricity distribution system where we've got a voltage and there's a current and all the plugs are the same size and there's balancing, throwing in mess to that situation is not going to help. You might want to throw in the occasional bit of disruption as a test, which I believe Netflix do. So Netflix have a little program that crawls through their database breaking things. They call it the Chaos Monkey. And the idea is that if you unleash that, because it's getting Netflix getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you keep unleashing the Chaos Monkey and seeing whether it can break something badly, at least you can sort of track back and figure out what it did and solve the problem. But it will find weaknesses in the system early. So, but generally with a highly ordered system, mess isn't going to make things better. It might test for weaknesses, but it's not going to make things better. When you're looking for new solutions, when you're trying in a creative situation, then adding new and difficult people, new and difficult circumstances, random shocks, I think will almost always help to spark a wide variety of solutions, one of which might be much better than what you currently have. So it's partly about the innovation in the system. It's partly also what is the cost of error, and what is the potential upside when we find some cool new thing. So I can tell you an industry that's been where the calculus has been changed. So Hollywood comedies are now much more improvised than they used to be. Is that because the fashion has changed? No. Is that because comedians are better at improvising these days than they used to be? Well, comedians have improvised for a long time, certainly since the 1970s, probably a long time before that. Now, what's changed is the technology's changed. So it used to be that the real constraint on a film is it costs so much to film, to get the camera, to get the crew. It's really tricky to edit. So, you want to do all your experimentation in the script. And then once you've got the script, the actors learn the lines and they deliver the script. But now it's easy. You've got multiple angles, lots of cameras. They're all cheap. It's super easy to edit. So you just do a take and another take and another take and another take, and the actors are just improvising. And of course, what they're improvising, lots of it's not usable, but some of it's brilliant. And then there's some person whose job is to take hours and hours and hours of improvisation of a particular scene and say, right, how do I weave together all the different ways this went out, all the different jokes? How do I pick the best and throw away the rest? So because the technology's changed, they can adopt a much more free-form approach because the technology is much more forgiving of that. So yeah, it's different in different situations, but in certain situations it's tremendously productive. What I would say also is the book is not in any way saying mess is always great. Like any situation you happen to be in, just add mess and it gets better. I don't believe that. I'm not arguing that. What I am saying is we are very, very fond of ordered systems. We're very fond of structure. We're very fond of targets, of quantification. And that's often very appropriate. It's often very effective. But we're so in love with it that we then impose highly structured processes on situations where a highly structured process does not help us at all. And it's a messy situation. We should embrace that mess, and instead we tidy it up. I can give you a very everyday example, by the way. So I'm a tidy person, except my desk. My desk is not very tidy. So why is my kitchen tidy and my desk is not tidy? Well, the answer is the kitchen and the desk are different environments. They're dealing with a different challenge. So the rule that the declutterers will often tell you is, well, everything needs to have a place and everything needs to go in its place. That's totally appropriate for your kitchen. Put the glassware in the glassware place and put the corkscrew in the corkscrew place and put your keys in the keys place, and then you won't lose your keys. If you go into my kitchen, it will be tidy because that works. But now let's apply the same approach. Everything has to have a place and everything goes in its place. Apply that approach to your email. So 100 emails come in a day. In principle, you could say, right, each of these emails has a place. I can create a folder. I can put all the emails in the right folders. And then my inbox will be empty and all the emails will be in the right folders. But it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's a highly dynamic system. It's partly the sheer pressure. But also, I've talked to the experts who've really studied this stuff. Very interesting. People who study how people use email, like scientifically, they're great. There's a guy called Steve Whitaker at UC Santa Clara who studies this. And he says one of the big issues is something called premature filing. So it turns out premature filing is a thing. And premature filing is basically what happens where something comes into your inbox. I mean, it happens with paper documents as well. But something comes into your inbox and you say, right, I need to put this somewhere because otherwise it's going to stay there being messy. It needs to be tidied somewhere. But you don't really know, this email, like it's about a project. You don't know whether the project is really going to kick off or not, or, it's maybe there's a new piece of information that you're probably going to have to throw away, but maybe it's going to be super relevant, so you keep it, and you don't know. And so if you do this too quickly, you file this stuff in folder categories that make sense to you at the time, and then 3 months later, they make no sense. You have this thing called failed folders. Failed folders like a folder with one email in, and then somewhere else in some other folder there's a duplicate folder of that folder with the other emails, and they're in different. It happens a lot. So that's when we take a messy situation, we try and apply a tidy solution to it, and it turns out that for most people, the flow of information is not very well structured as it comes in, and you're better off being a bit loose with it until it structures itself more clearly in your mind. If, on the other hand, you're, say, an accountant, it's nothing to do with the personality of accountants. It's to do with the structure of the information that comes in. Very highly structured. You've got different clients, you've got different forms. It's very clear where. Then, you should be worried if you have a messy accountant. But that is to do with the fact that the information is highly ordered already when it comes in, and therefore you can keep it ordered, and it's perfectly appropriate. Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I get your periodic emails, so I had already read your story about Keith Jarrett. And it made me think about the title of your book, and having listened tonight to your examples, it's really about disruption, it seems to me, more than mess. And so my question is, when we use organization a lot to try to understand underlying principles of things, and throwing in disruption helps test your assumptions and fix the order in some way. So how do you find that right balance between applying order? Your email case is a good example. If you have too much order, then you can't find things. If you have not enough order, then you can't find things. So how do you know when you're in the right place, or is it a constant cycle of order and disruption?
There's definitely something cyclical, isn't there? I find sometimes my desk is very tidy and then it gets really messy. And then, of course, I get the causation backwards, because my desk is getting messy because I'm really busy, and so I'm getting a little stressed. And then I think it's the desk's fault. Like, this messy desk is making me stressed, but actually the fact that I'm busy is making my desk messy and also making me stressed. But I think, and we did write another book about experimentation and all about how some things you just need to keep trying and experiment and see what works, and test your data and get people to give you feedback, and experimentation is very important. So some of these things I think we can only ever discover for ourselves through experimentation. So much is context specific, and so much is also to do with our own skills and our own preferences. But I think that I've persuaded myself, at least, maybe I've persuaded some other people, what I've found is we tend to systematically overvalue the ordered approaches and the structured approaches, and undervalue the messy approaches. The messy approaches, they look uglier. We feel we have to justify them to other people more. They often make us more anxious, and so we feel like they're not working. And yet, actually, in the end, you get good results. So I would always sort of say, well, maybe try, if you've found what you think is the right balance, maybe try a little bit of extra disruption and see where it gets you. But maybe you found the perfect balance, and that's all great. Thank you.
Evening.
Just a heads up real quick. Sorry, this will be our last question.
Okay.
I'm curious about the role of planning in terms of messiness. Is there a messy approach to planning? Do you like the idea of plans, or should we just kind of have no plans and just kind of play around and see what works?
So thank you. So again, it depends on the problem. I recently did a big house renovation, and I was really glad that the builder had a very, very detailed plan and a very detailed checklist, because there are lots and lots of complex moving parts, and a lot of stuff needs to be ordered a long time in advance. You need to make sure they all arrive. But at the same time, he would also have to improvise from time to time because things would go wrong. But that's a situation where planning will get you a long way, and planning really helps, because a lot of the structure of the problem was internally complex, and you could sort of figure it all out on paper, and that's cheaper. But very often we face situations where the situation we're in is messy, and so there's constant changes, constant unpredictability, and so you want to keep your planning very loose and adapt and see where the situation takes you. So some of the research I discussed in the book was actually about students being invited to, they were trained in study skills. And so one group of students was told, what you should do is you block out your time during the day. So when you're going to study different things, and so use your diary as a daily to-do list. And then other students were told, you should set goals by the month and kind of block out your time in a sort of like, maybe spend this week working on this thing, and then the next week working on, so much looser. And the psychologists who did this study thought that the daily plans would be more effective because they're more specific, right? And they don't give you as much room to wiggle out of doing work. But actually, the daily plans were completely disastrous. And the reason seems to be that, well, the plan would be knocked off immediately, because then the friend comes around for coffee and you're supposed to be doing maths between 11 and 12, or, but the friend's there, or the washing machine breaks, you need to get the washing machine fixed, and stuff happens always. And so every day, at the end of the day, actually before even the end of the day, you'd be 10:30 in the morning and already you're behind on the plan. And now what do? You have to rip up the plan already, and so people become very, very discouraged. The plan wasn't serving them very well. Whereas the people who planned on a monthly basis was fine, because the plan was much looser. They felt they had an overall vision, they had an overall structure that worked for them, but they wouldn't be constantly downhearted and feeling that things were letting them down. So it depends on the problem, depends on the situation. But again, we probably plan a little bit too much and trust in our plans a little bit too much. And a bit of a looser, more flexible system would work best for us.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.